The bark came off the cottonwood in strips, gray and bitter on the tongue, but it filled the hollow ache that had become their constant companion through the long winter months. Martha Cates scraped another piece with her knife, the blade worn thin from use, and dropped the shavings into the pot of boiling water that would have to serve as soup again tonight. Her hands shook, not from the cold, though the cabin drafts cut through her patched dress like winter wolves, but from the weakness that came with 3 months of eating what God never intended for human consumption. "Mama, I ain't hungry," little Sarah whispered from the corner where she sat wrapped in the quilt Martha had sewn from feed sacks back when they still had grain to buy. The child's eyes seemed too large for her thin face, and Martha's heart twisted at the lie. Sarah was always hungry now. They all were. "You eat what I give you, child," Martha said, her voice gentler than her words. She couldn't afford gentleness in her tone. It might break what little resolve held her together. Growing girls need their strength. 8-year-old Benjamin looked up from where he'd been whittling a piece of kindling into nothing, just to keep his hands busy. "When's Papa coming home?" The question hung in the cabin's stale air like smoke from a dying fire. Martha had stopped expecting Theo 3 weeks past, when the snows should have broken enough for travel from the mining camps up north. She'd stopped looking down the valley road 2 weeks ago. But she hadn't stopped hoping, and that hope felt like another kind of hunger. "Soon," she said, because what else could a mother say to children who'd already lost too much? The sound of horses outside made them all freeze. Martha's hand went instinctively to the rifle hanging above the door, though she had no ammunition left to load it with. Creditors had been circling like buzzards since December, and the widow Morrison's threats about the mortgage had grown sharper with each passing week. But the knock that came was gentle, almost hesitant. "Mrs. Cates? It's Doc Harrison." Martha opened the door to find the elderly physician standing in the late March wind, his medical bag in one hand and a cloth-covered basket in the other. Behind him, his horse stamped and snorted, breath steaming in the cold air. "Doc," she said, pulling her shawl tighter. "Nobody's sick here that needs doctoring." "I can see that ain't exactly true," he said, his kind eyes taking in her gaunt frame and the hollow-cheeked faces of her children peering around her skirts. "Mind if I come in? Got something for you." Pride warred with necessity in Martha's chest. Pride lost, as it had been losing for months now. "Come in, then." Doc Harrison set the basket on their rough wooden table and pulled back the cloth to reveal fresh bread, a jar of preserves, and a small sack of cornmeal. Sarah made a small sound of longing that cut Martha to the bone. "Doc, I can't pay. Didn't ask you to." He opened his medical bag and withdrew a bottle of tonic. "This is for the children. Iron and vitamins. Help build their strength back up." "Who sent this?" Martha asked, though she dreaded the answer. Charity from the church ladies came with expectations and judgments she couldn't bear right now. Someone who don't want their name spoken. Doc Harrison's weathered face creased with what might have been a smile. "But they asked me to tell you more's coming. And that you shouldn't worry about the source." After the doctor left, Martha watched her children eat real bread with reverence, their thin fingers careful not to waste a single crumb. She allowed herself one small piece, savoring the taste of wheat and yeast like a prayer answered. That night, for the first time in weeks, Sarah didn't cry herself to sleep from hunger pains. 3 days later, Martha found a sack of potatoes on her doorstep, along with a small bag of coffee beans and a note written in careful script, "For the children. More will come." She looked up and down the valley road, but saw no one. The morning mist clung to the creek bottom, and the cottonwoods stood bare and patient, as if keeping secrets. A week passed. Then another basket appeared, this one containing salt pork, dried beans, and a bolt of sturdy blue fabric. Martha ran her fingers over the cloth. Good quality, suitable for making the children new clothes to replace the ones that hung loose on their shrinking frames. "Mama, who keeps bringing us food?" Benjamin asked as they shared a proper stew for the first time since Christmas. "I don't know, son. But we give thanks to the Lord for his provision." "Maybe it's Papa," Sarah suggested, hope bright in her young voice. Martha didn't have the heart to tell her that Theo would have no money for such generosity, even if he were alive and well. The mining camps paid poorly when they paid at all, and her husband had left with nothing but determination and the promise to return before spring planting. 2 weeks into April, the mysterious gifts had become a lifeline. Flour and sugar appeared regularly, along with eggs from someone's hens and fresh milk that suggested their benefactor lived close enough to deliver it while still warm. Martha began to regain some strength, and color returned to her children's cheeks. But the gifts brought questions from neighbors and unwanted attention from those who'd shown little interest in the Cates family's welfare before their mysterious good fortune began. "Heard you been getting regular deliveries," said Ezra Bowles when he rode up one afternoon, his pale eyes scanning Martha's property with the acquisitive gaze of a man who measured everything by its potential profit. Bowles owned the general store and held mortgages on half the farms in the valley. His visits never brought good news. "Don't know what you mean," Martha replied, though she was keenly aware of the fresh loaf of bread cooling on her kitchen table. "Someone's been mighty generous." Makes a man wonder what sort of arrangement might prompt such charity. The insinuation hit Martha like a slap. Heat rose in her cheeks, but she kept her voice level. "The Lord provides, Mr. Bowles, in his own mysterious ways." "Indeed he does." Bowles's smile was thin and cold. "Just remember, Mrs. Cates, that your husband's debts don't disappear with his absence. The mortgage payment is due 1st of May, and Widow Morrison ain't known for her patience with delinquent accounts." After he left, Martha sat at her table and wept, the first tears she'd allowed herself since the gifts began appearing. $600. That's what Theo owed on their 160 acres, and she had nothing close to that amount. The land had been in Theo's family for 15 years, cleared and improved with his father's sweat and blood. Now it might pass to strangers because of circumstances beyond their control. That evening, as she was preparing supper with the last of the salt pork from the morning's delivery, she heard horses again. This time, there were several riders, and Martha's blood chilled as she recognized the voices. Rough men, the kind who did Bowles's dirty work when legal pressure wasn't sufficient. Mrs. Cates, called Jake Morrison, the widow's nephew and a man with a reputation for violence when crossed. "We need to talk." Martha opened the door just wide enough to speak through the gap. "It's past supper time, Mr. Morrison. Whatever business you have can wait for daylight." "Business won't wait." Morrison pushed the door open and stepped inside, followed by 2 other men Martha recognized from the saloons in town. "Heard you been living pretty well for a family that can't pay its debts." Sarah whimpered and pressed closer to Benjamin, who stood protective in front of his sister despite his own fear. Martha moved between the men and her children, wishing again for ammunition for the rifle. "I don't know what you're implying, but—" "Implying nothing. Stating facts." Morrison's gaze swept over the evidence of their recent meals, the clean dishes, the remaining bread, the healthy color in the children's faces. "Someone's been taking care of you real well. Makes me wonder what services you might be providing in return." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Martha felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been sleeping through the long months of hunger and desperation. It woke with the fierce protectiveness of a mother wolf. "Get out of my house. Now, Mrs. Cates, no need to get unfriendly. We're just here to remind you that debts come due regardless of alternative arrangements," you might have made. I said get out. Morrison stepped closer, close enough that Martha could smell the whiskey on his breath. You got until May 1st. After that, this land gets sold at auction, and you and those children will be looking for somewhere else to call home. After they left, Martha barred the door and gathered her children close. Sarah was crying silently, the way she'd learned to do during the worst of the winter, and Benjamin's small hands were clenched into fists. "Mama, what did those men want?" he asked. "Nothing important, son. Nothing at all." But Martha knew better. The visits would continue, and the pressure would increase. Whoever had been helping them had inadvertently painted a target on their backs. In a community where survival often meant minding your own business, sudden prosperity raised questions and suspicions that could prove more dangerous than starvation. That night, after the children were asleep, Martha sat by the dying fire and tried to formulate a plan. She could write to her sister in Kansas, beg for help, but the letter would take weeks to arrive and weeks more for any response. She could try to find work in town, but that would mean leaving the children alone, and after tonight's visit, she didn't dare. The sound of something heavy being set down on her porch made her heart race. Another gift, delivered under cover of darkness, as all the others had been. But this time, Martha was determined to discover her benefactor's identity. She crept to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. A figure moved in the shadows by her door. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the careful quiet of someone accustomed to not being seen. In the dim starlight, she couldn't make out features, but something about the silhouette seemed familiar. When the figure mounted a horse and rode away, Martha waited several minutes before opening the door. On her porch sat a large burlap sack containing flour, beans, dried meat, and at the bottom, something that made her gasp, a small leather pouch heavy with silver coins. More money than she'd seen in months, though still nowhere near enough to satisfy the mortgage. Tucked under the pouch was another note: "Do not lose hope. Help is coming. Keep the children safe." Martha stared at the careful handwriting by lamplight, searching for any clue to its author's identity. The paper was good quality, the kind sold at Bowles's store but also available in the larger towns down valley. The ink was fresh, suggesting someone with regular access to writing supplies. But it was the words themselves that gave her pause. Keep the children safe suggested knowledge of the threat Morrison and his men represented. Someone was watching, someone who understood the danger they faced. As April progressed toward May, the gifts continued with increasing frequency and value. Fresh vegetables appeared, turnips, onions, early greens that spoke of someone's careful garden planning. A bag of seed corn arrived just as the ground became workable for planting, along with a note suggesting the best fields for spring crops. Martha began to garden again, her strength returning with proper nutrition. She planted the corn and tended the rows with a hope she hadn't felt since Theo left. The children helped, their laughter returning as their bodies healed from months of near starvation. But the deadline loomed, and Martha's mysterious benefactor, generous as they were, couldn't solve the larger problem. $600 might as well have been $6,000 for all her ability to raise such a sum. On the last Tuesday in April, Martha was hoeing her garden when she heard a commotion from the direction of town. Riders were coming up the valley road in numbers that suggested urgency or trouble. She called the children inside and watched from her window as a group of men approached. But these weren't Morrison's thugs or Bowles's collectors. Doc Harrison rode in front, followed by several of the more respectable farmers from down valley. Behind them came a wagon driven by Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church, and bringing up the rear, Sheriff Coleman with his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. Martha's heart hammered as she opened the door to meet them. "Mrs. Cates," Doc Harrison said, dismounting with the stiffness of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle. We need to talk to you about your situation here. If it's about the mortgage, I know what I owe. I know when it's due. It's about more than that now, Sheriff Coleman said, his expression grim. We've had reports of harassment, threats made against you and the children. That true? Martha hesitated. Admitting to the threats might bring protection, but it would also confirm that she couldn't handle her own affairs. In a frontier community, that admission could be as dangerous as the threats themselves. There's been some pressure regarding the debt, she said carefully. Jake Morrison and his boys been bothering you? The sheriff pressed. Before Martha could answer, Pastor Williams spoke up. Mrs. Cates, there's something you should know. Theo sent word. The bottom dropped out of Martha's world. Is my husband? He's alive, the pastor said quickly. Injured in a mine collapse back in February, but alive and recovering. He sent a letter with a supply train that just reached the territorial capital. Word came down to us yesterday. Martha's knees went weak with relief. Theo was alive. Hurt, but alive. The children would have their father back. There's more, Doc Harrison said gently. Theo managed to earn some money before the accident. Sent it with his letter, but the courier was robbed on the way. Lost everything, including most of the letter. Only fragment that survived was enough to confirm he's alive and trying to get home. The brief surge of hope crumbled. Theo was alive but penniless, and the mortgage deadline was still approaching with inexorable certainty. However, said Jim Patterson, one of the valley's more prosperous farmers, we've been talking among ourselves. About what's been happening here, about the gifts you've been receiving. Martha's heart sank. If the community knew about her mysterious benefactor, gossip and speculation would make her situation even worse. We know someone's been helping your family, Patterson continued. Don't know who, and frankly, don't much care. What we care about is that you're good people, and good people don't deserve to lose their land because of circumstances beyond their control. What Jim's trying to say, Doc Harrison added, is that we've taken up a collection. Families throughout the valley have contributed what they can spare. Sheriff Coleman reached into his coat and withdrew a leather envelope. It ain't the full amount you owe, but it's substantial. Combined with whatever you might have saved, it should cover most of the mortgage payment. Martha stared at the envelope as if it might disappear like morning mist. I don't understand. Why would you all? Because that's what neighbors do, Pastor Williams said simply. We look after each other when times get hard. The Lord works through many hands, Mrs. Cates. Sometimes he sends mysterious gifts in the night. Sometimes he moves the hearts of a community to action. As the men prepared to leave, Doc Harrison lingered. Martha, he said quietly, I want you to know that whoever's been helping you these past months, they care deeply about your family's welfare. That kind of devotion doesn't come from strangers. Martha spent that evening counting the money from the community collection, $430, more than she'd dared hope for but still short of what she needed. Combined with the silver coins from her mysterious benefactor, she had enough to make a significant payment, but not enough to satisfy the full debt. Still, for the first time since Theo left, she allowed herself to believe that somehow, they might keep their land. The community's support had shown her that she and the children weren't as alone as she'd believed. And Theo was alive, fighting to return to them even if he couldn't bring the salvation they desperately needed. As she tucked her children into bed that night, Sarah looked up with eyes that held trust instead of fear. Mama, are we going to be all right? Martha smoothed her daughter's hair, noting how much stronger and healthier the child looked compared to the skeletal waif of 3 months ago. I believe we are, sweetheart. I truly believe we are. Outside, the spring wind rustled through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the darkness, Martha imagined she heard the sound of a horse moving carefully along the creek bottom. Her mysterious guardian was still watching, still protecting, still keeping secrets that might yet prove to be the difference between salvation and ruin. The morning would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time in months, Martha Cates fell asleep without the gnawing fear that had become her constant companion. Theo was alive. The community stood with her. And someone who cared enough to risk discovery in service of her family's survival, was still out there in the darkness, keeping watch over them all. The first day of May dawned clear and warm, with the promise of summer already stirring in the valley air. Martha rose before the children, as had become her custom, and stepped onto the porch to find another gift waiting. This time, a small wooden crate containing fresh eggs, a jar of honey, and tucked beneath them, a folded paper that made her heart skip when she recognized the careful handwriting. Today brings challenges, but also answers. Trust in what comes. The children's future depends on choices made this day. Have faith. Martha read the note 3 times before the sound of horses approaching made her look up sharply. It was barely past dawn, too early for social calls, and the deliberate pace of the riders suggested official business. She recognized Sheriff Coleman's bay gelding first, then Doc Harrison's gray mare. But the third horse carried a stranger, a tall man in a dark coat who sat his saddle with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to authority. "Mrs. Cates," Sheriff Coleman called as they drew near. "Sorry to disturb you so early, but we've got some urgent business needs attending to." Martha stepped down from the porch, smoothing her apron with hands that trembled slightly. "If it's about the mortgage payment, I have most of what's owed." "Not all, but—" "It's not about the money you owe," the stranger said, dismounting with fluid grace. "It's about money that's owed to you." He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 35, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples and eyes the color of winter sky. There was something familiar about him, a nagging recognition that danced just beyond her grasp. "I don't understand," Martha said. Doc Harrison cleared his throat. "Martha, this here is James Mitchell. He's a lawyer from the territorial capital, and he's got some news about Theo." "Is my husband—" Fear clutched at her throat. "Your husband is very much alive, Mrs. Cates," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of an educated man. "And as of yesterday, he's also considerably wealthier than when he left for the mining camps." Mitchell reached into his coat and withdrew a thick envelope sealed with red wax. 3 days ago, the Consolidated Mining Company struck a major silver vein in the claim where your husband was working. As part of the crew that discovered the strike, Theo is entitled to a significant bonus, $3,000 to be precise. Martha stared at the envelope as if it contained snakes rather than salvation. $3,000 was more money than she'd seen in her entire life, enough to pay off the mortgage 3 times over and still leave plenty for improvements to the farm. But the courier who was robbed was carrying Theo's personal savings and his letter to you, Mitchell explained. The company bonus was sent through different channels for security. Theo should arrive himself within the week, but he wanted to ensure the mortgage payment was made on time. Before Martha could fully process this miraculous turn of events, the sound of more horses interrupted. This time, the riders came fast and hard. Jake Morrison leading a group of men that included Ezra Bowles and several others Martha recognized as the less savory elements of the community. Morrison reined up hard in front of the cabin, his horse dancing and snorting from the rough treatment. Well, looks like the cavalry's arrived to protect our local charity case." "Morning, Jake," Sheriff Coleman said mildly, though his hand rested casually on his gun belt. "You're out early for a social call." "Nothing social about it," Today's the day Mrs. Cates here learns what happens when debts come due and payments can't be made. Morrison's gaze fixed on Martha with predatory intensity. Brought the auction papers with me. Soon as the deadline passes, this property gets sold to the highest bidder. Bowles urged his horse forward, his pale eyes glittering with anticipation. Should fetch a fair price. Good farmland, decent cabin, close enough to town for convenience. Course, it'll have to sell quick. Can't have property sitting empty with winter coming on. Gentlemen, James Mitchell interrupted, his voice cutting through their bravado like a blade through silk. I'm afraid you're operating under outdated information. Morrison's sneer faltered slightly. And who might you be? James Mitchell, territorial attorney. I'm here representing the interests of Theo and Martha Cates in the matter of their mortgage obligations. Mitchell's tone remained conversational, but something in his bearing made Morrison's companions shift uneasily in their saddles. Don't matter who you are, Morrison blustered. Debt's debt, and today's the day it comes due. $600, cash money, or the property goes to auction. Indeed it does. Mitchell opened the envelope and counted out bills with deliberate precision. $100, $200, $300, $400, $500, $600. Plus interest and penalties as calculated by territorial banking regulations, an additional $47.32. The money lay in neat stacks on Martha's porch rail, more cash than most of the men present had ever seen in one place. Morrison's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on an unhealthy shade of red. Where'd that money come from? Bowles demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion and disappointment. Legitimate business interests, Mitchell replied smoothly. All properly documented and verified through territorial banking channels. Mrs. Cates, if you would witness this transaction. Martha's signature on the receipt felt like the most important thing she'd ever written. As Mitchell handed over the mortgage papers marked, "Paid in full," she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. "This ain't over," Morrison growled, but his threat lacked conviction. The legal authority represented by Mitchell and the sheriff's obvious support for the Cates family had deflated his earlier aggression. "Oh, but I believe it is," Mitchell said pleasantly. "Unless, of course, you'd like to discuss the legality of some of your recent collection methods? I understand there have been complaints about harassment and intimidation tactics." Morrison and his men departed with considerably less bravado than they'd arrived with, leaving Martha standing on her porch with a paid mortgage and a head spinning from the sudden reversal of fortune. "Mama!" Sarah appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. "What's happening?" "Something wonderful, sweetheart," Martha said, kneeling to embrace her daughter. "We're going to keep our home." As the morning progressed and the news spread through the valley, neighbors began arriving to offer congratulations and share in the celebration. The widow Morrison herself appeared around midday, her austere face creased with what might have been embarrassment. "Mrs. Cates," she said stiffly, "I want you to know that my nephew's behavior was his own doing. I never authorized harassment of you or your children." Martha accepted the apology graciously, though she suspected the widow's sudden change of heart had more to do with Theo's newfound wealth than genuine remorse. By afternoon, the Cates cabin had become the center of an impromptu community gathering. Women brought food, men discussed plans for summer crops, and children played in the yard while adults talked and laughed with the easy camaraderie of shared relief. Through it all, James Mitchell remained, helping with legal paperwork and answering questions about territorial law with the patience of a man accustomed to explaining complex matters to frontier families. Martha found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, still puzzled by the sense that she should know him. It was Doc Harrison who finally provided the answer she sought. You don't remember him, do you? The doctor asked quietly as they stood apart from the crowd. Should I? James Mitchell. Think back about 8 years. Young lawyer, fresh from back east, got thrown from his horse during that bad storm in September. Broke his leg, pretty severe. Memory flooded back with startling clarity. A young man, pale with pain and fever, whom Theo had found unconscious by the creek and brought home for nursing. She'd tended him for 2 weeks while Doc Harrison was away delivering the Patterson baby, feeding him broth and changing bandages and reading to him from her precious few books. Jimmy, she whispered. Calls himself James now, but yes. Jimmy Mitchell, who used to say you saved his life with your nursing and your kindness. Doc Harrison's weathered face creased with something that might have been a smile. Funny how the Lord works sometimes, bringing people back into our lives just when we need them most. Martha stared across the yard at the man who had once been a frightened young stranger in her home. The boy who had thanked her with tears in his eyes when he finally left, promising he would never forget her kindness. The young lawyer who had said he would find a way to repay her someday. The gifts, she said suddenly. All those months, the food and supplies. I wouldn't know anything about that, Doc Harrison said, but his eyes twinkled with suppressed mirth. Though I did notice that James, bought himself a cabin about 5 miles up the creek last winter. Quiet place, good for a man who values his privacy. As if sensing her scrutiny, James looked up from where he was explaining something to Pastor Williams. Their eyes met across the crowded yard, and Martha saw in his expression the same gentle determination that had sustained her family through their darkest months. The revelation should have brought closure, but instead it raised new questions. A lawyer from the territorial capital, a man of obvious education and means, who had spent months watching over her family from the shadows. The careful notes, the precisely chosen supplies, the timing that had kept them alive while never quite solving their larger problems. It all spoke of someone who understood exactly what they needed and when they needed it. That evening, as the last of the neighbors departed and the children settled into sleep with full bellies and secure hearts, Martha found James standing by the creek, watching the water flow silver in the moonlight. You've been taking care of us all along, she said softly, approaching him with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust good fortune too easily. I owed you a debt, he replied without turning. Seemed only right to repay it when I could. What you owed me could have been settled with a basket of food or a small gift. What you did. She gestured toward the cabin where her children slept safe and fed. That was something else entirely. Now he did turn, and in the moonlight she could see something vulnerable in his expression, something that reminded her of the frightened young man she'd once nursed back to health. When I heard about Theo leaving for the mining camps, when I realized you'd be alone here with the children through the winter. He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. I couldn't bear the thought of you suffering. Not when I had the means to help. So you watched over us. Like a guardian angel. More like a man who never forgot the kindness of a woman who had no reason to trust him but did anyway. James stepped closer, close enough that Martha could see the intensity in his eyes. When Doc Harrison told me about your situation, about the threats you were facing, I knew I had to do more than just leave anonymous gifts. The money Theo earned is real. Every penny of it, legitimately earned and properly documented. I simply made sure the legal channels moved as quickly as possible when I learned about your mortgage deadline. Martha studied his face in the moonlight, seeing past the successful lawyer to the man who had spent months ensuring her family's survival. You never married. It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. Never found anyone who measured up to the woman who showed mercy to a stranger. The words hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she dared cross. Theo was alive, returning home, and she was a married woman with children and responsibilities. But the man standing before her had protected her family with a devotion that spoke of more than simple gratitude. "James," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I don't expect anything, Martha. I never did. I just wanted to make sure you and the children were safe. Now that Theo is coming home, now that your future is secure, I can step back into the shadows where I belong." "Is that what you want? To disappear again?" "What I want and what's right aren't always the same thing." Before Martha could respond, the sound of a horse approaching at speed made them both turn toward the road. Even in the darkness, she recognized the desperate urgency of the rider's pace, the way someone rode when carrying news that couldn't wait for morning. Young Billy Patterson reined up hard in front of the cabin, his horse lathered and blowing. "Mrs. Cates, Mr. Mitchell, you need to come quick." "What's wrong, son?" James stepped forward, his lawyer's instincts taking over. "It's Jake Morrison and his men. They're headed for the Hendricks place with torches and ropes. Word is they're planning to burn out Old Man Hendricks for testifying against them in court last month." Martha felt ice form in her stomach. The Hendricks family included 2 young children and a pregnant woman. If Morrison was desperate enough to resort to violence against witnesses, no one in the valley would be safe from his retaliation. "How many men does he have?" James asked, already moving toward his horse. 6 or 7, maybe more. They've been drinking all evening, working themselves up for it. Someone needs to warn the Hendricks family and get help." James was in his saddle before Martha could blink, checking his rifle and cartridge belt with practiced efficiency. "Billy, you ride to town and fetch Sheriff Coleman. Tell him what's happening and that he needs to bring deputies." "What about the Hendricks family?" Martha asked. "I'm going there now. Maybe I can talk sense into Morrison before this goes too far." "You can't face 7 men alone," Martha protested, though she was already running toward the cabin. If violence was coming to the valley, she needed to make sure her own children were protected. "I won't be alone," James called back. "The whole community will rally once word spreads. That's how these things work out here. Nobody stands alone when neighbors are threatened." As Billy Patterson rode hard toward town and James spurred his horse toward the Hendricks place, Martha barred her door and checked the rifle hanging above it. Empty as always, but its presence was still comforting. She gathered her children from their beds and settled them in the root cellar, just in case Morrison's violence spread beyond its intended target. "Mama, what's happening?" Benjamin asked, his young face serious with the gravity of adult fears. "Some bad men are trying to hurt good people, son. But there are more good people than bad ones, and the good people will stop them." "Like Papa would if he was here?" "Like Papa would, yes. And like Mr. Mitchell and Sheriff Coleman and all the neighbors who care about doing what's right." Martha settled her children as comfortably as possible in the cellar and then climbed back to the main cabin to watch from the windows. In the distance, toward the Hendricks place, she could see the orange glow of torches moving through the darkness like malevolent stars. The waiting was agony. Every sound of wind or settling timber made her jump, and she found herself straining to hear hoofbeats that might signal news, good or bad, from the confrontation playing out miles away. It was nearly midnight when she finally heard horses returning. Multiple riders, moving at a steady pace rather than the desperate gallop of emergency. She remained hidden until she recognized Doc Harrison's voice calling her name. "Martha! It's all right, you can come out." She emerged from the cabin to find Doc Harrison accompanied by Pastor Williams and 2 men she didn't recognize. Farmers from Down Valley, by their look. "Is everyone safe?" she asked immediately. "Everyone's fine," Doc Harrison assured her. "James got there in time to warn the Hendricks family, and by the time Morrison and his men showed up, half the valley was waiting for them. Amazing how fast word travels when neighbors are threatened." Pastor Williams nodded with satisfaction. 43 men, all armed and determined to protect their community. Morrison took one look at what he was facing and decided his grievances weren't worth dying for. What happens now? Sheriff Coleman arrested Morrison and 3 of his men for conspiracy to commit arson and assault, one of the strangers said. The others scattered when they realized they were outnumbered 4-1. "Won't be causing trouble in this valley anymore." Doc Harrison stepped closer, his expression gentle with understanding. "James asked me to tell you he's gone back to the territorial capital on business. Said he didn't want to complicate your reunion with Theo when he gets home." Martha felt something twist in her chest, disappointment mixed with relief mixed with a sadness she couldn't fully explain. James Mitchell had appeared in her life like an answer to prayer, solved her family's most desperate problems, protected them from threats she hadn't even fully understood, and now he was gone again as mysteriously as he'd come. "Did he say?" she began, then stopped. What could she ask? When he might return? Whether he would stay in touch? Whether the connection she'd felt standing by the creek in the moonlight had been real or just the product of gratitude and moonbeams. "He said to tell you that watching over your family had been the greatest privilege of his life," Doc Harrison said quietly. "And that he hopes Theo appreciates what a remarkable woman he married." 3 days later, Martha was working in her garden when she heard a familiar voice calling her name. She looked up to see Theo riding up the valley road, thinner than when he'd left but alive and whole and smiling with the joy of a man coming home to everything he held dear. Her children ran to meet him with shrieks of delight, and Martha followed more slowly, her heart full of gratitude and love and a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't fully sort out. Theo was home, their land was safe, their future was secure. Everything she had prayed for through the long winter months had come to pass. But as she embraced her husband and felt his strong arms around her, she couldn't quite banish the memory of winter nights when mysterious gifts appeared on her porch, or the sound of James Mitchell's voice saying her name in the moonlight by the creek. Some debts, she realized, could never be fully repaid. And some acts of love left marks on the heart that time would never completely erase. Summer settled over the valley like a warm blessing, bringing with it the kind of abundance that made the previous winter's suffering feel like a distant nightmare. Theo threw himself into the work of restoring their farm with the desperate energy of a man who had tasted mortality and found it bitter. The silver mine bonus had not only paid their debts but provided enough capital to make improvements that had been dreams for years: a new barn, additional livestock, and the luxury of hired help during harvest time. Martha watched her husband work from dawn to dusk, his movements driven by more than simple determination. There was something almost frantic in the way he attacked each task, as if he could somehow make up for the months of absence through sheer physical effort. She understood the guilt that drove him, the knowledge that his family had suffered while he was away. But she also recognized the shadow that had settled between them like an uninvited guest at their table. "Theo," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard, their laughter bright against the backdrop of cricket songs and evening bird calls. "You did what you had to do. Nobody blames you for what happened while you were gone." Theo's weathered hands stilled on the harness he'd been mending. "Don't I, though? Every time I look at the children, I see how thin they got, how scared they must have been. Every time I see you, I wonder what you went through that you ain't telling me about." Martha felt the weight of unspoken truths pressing against her chest. There was so much Theo didn't know, so much she couldn't bring herself to share. The depth of their desperation, the way they'd scraped bark from trees to fill their bellies, the nights she'd lain awake wondering if her children would survive until morning. And beneath it all, the memory of James Mitchell's careful protection, his midnight vigils, the sound of his voice in the moonlight saying things that had awakened feelings she had no right to harbor. "We survived," she said simply. "The Lord provided, and we survived." "The Lord provided," Theo repeated, but there was something in his tone that suggested he knew there was more to the story. Doc Harrison mentioned there were folks helping out. Anonymous gifts, and such. Martha's needle paused in the mending she'd picked up to keep her hands busy. Neighbors look after neighbors. That's the way of things out here. Anonymous neighbors who could afford to give away that much food and supplies through a hard winter? Theo's eyes found hers in the growing dusk. Must have been someone with considerable means. Before Martha could respond, the sound of horses approaching interrupted their conversation. 3 riders emerged from the evening shadows, and Martha's heart leaped when she recognized Sheriff Coleman's familiar figure, accompanied by 2 men she didn't know. "Evening, Theo, Martha," the sheriff called as they dismounted. "Sorry to disturb your family time, but we've got some business needs discussing." Theo stood, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle that leaned against the porch rail. Months in the mining camps had taught him that late-night visits from law enforcement rarely brought good news. "What kind of business, Sheriff?" "The kind that involves Jake Morrison and his associates," one of the strangers said, stepping forward into the lamplight spilling from the cabin windows. He was a compact man with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "I'm Deputy Marshal Clayton from the Territorial Capital. We've been investigating Morrison's activities, and your family's situation has come to our attention." Martha felt ice form in her stomach. "Our situation?" "The harassment you endured, the threats made against you and your children," Clayton explained. "Morrison and his men have been running similar operations throughout the territory, targeting vulnerable families, using intimidation and violence to force property sales at below-market prices, then reselling for substantial profits." "What does that have to do with us?" Theo asked, though Martha could hear the tension in his voice. "Our mortgage is paid. Morrison has no claim on our land. The criminal charges against Morrison require witness testimony," Sheriff Coleman said. "Mrs. Cates witnessed several instances of harassment and intimidation. Her testimony could be crucial in ensuring Morrison and his associates face justice." Theo looked at Martha, seeing something in her expression that made his jaw tighten. "What kind of harassment? What exactly happened while I was gone?" Martha found herself caught between her husband's need to know and her reluctance to burden him with knowledge that would only increase his guilt. But the marshal's expectant gaze and the weight of justice demanded honesty. "Morrison and his men came here several times," she said carefully. "Made threats about what would happen if the mortgage wasn't paid. Implied." She faltered, remembering Morrison's insinuations about the services she might be providing in exchange for the mysterious gifts. "Implied what?" Theo's voice was dangerously quiet. "That the help we were receiving must be payment for inappropriate services," Martha finished, her cheeks burning with remembered shame. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Theo's breathing, harsh and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold fury of a man pushed beyond his limits. "They threatened my wife and children. In my own home." "Theo," Martha said quickly, recognizing the dangerous gleam in his eyes. "It's over. They can't hurt us anymore." "Ma'am," Deputy Marshal Clayton interjected, "with respect, it's not over for other families who might face the same threats. Morrison's operation has left a trail of destroyed lives across 3 counties. Your testimony could help put him away for years." Theo stood abruptly, his hands clenched into fists. "When's the trial?" "2 weeks from Thursday, in the territorial capital," Clayton replied. Mrs. Cates would need to travel there to testify, but the territory would cover all expenses and provide protection during her stay. "I'll be going with her," Theo said flatly. "She don't travel anywhere alone, not with Morrison's men still running loose." "Actually," Sheriff Coleman said, clearing his throat awkwardly, "most of Morrison's associates have been arrested or fled the territory. The few remaining are being watched closely. Mrs. Cates would be perfectly safe." Something in the sheriff's tone caught Martha's attention, a carefully neutral quality that suggested there was more to the story than he was sharing. "Sheriff, is there something else we should know?" Clayton and Coleman exchanged glances before the deputy marshal spoke. "James Mitchell will be prosecuting the case. As territorial attorney, he's been building the case against Morrison for months. Your testimony would be given to him directly." The name hit Martha like a physical blow. James Mitchell, the man who had protected her family through their darkest hours, who had stood by the creek in moonlight and spoken of debts that could never be repaid. The man who had disappeared rather than complicate her reunion with Theo. "I see," Martha said quietly, though she saw far more than she wished to. Theo's gaze sharpened as he caught the undercurrent of tension in the conversation. "This Mitchell fellow, he's the territorial attorney who handled the mortgage payment?" "Among other things," Clayton replied diplomatically. "What other things?" Martha felt the weight of her husband's suspicion and knew that the careful balance they'd maintained since his return was about to shatter. There were too many secrets, too many half-truths, too many connections that pointed toward a reality Theo was only beginning to understand. "Theo," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I think it's time I heard the whole story. About the gifts, about the harassment, about this Mitchell fellow who seems to know an awful lot about my family's business." Before Martha could respond, 8-year-old Benjamin appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes. "Mama? Who's here? Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Martha said quickly, rising to gather her son. "Just some grown-up business that needs talking through." As she tucked Benjamin back into bed, Martha's mind raced through the implications of the marshal's visit. Testifying against Morrison would mean facing James Mitchell again, seeing the man who had shown her a kind of devotion she'd never experienced, even from her own husband. It would mean acknowledging publicly the depth of their family's desperation and the mysterious help that had sustained them. But more than that, it would mean confronting the truth about her own feelings, the way her heart had responded to James's gentle protection, the complex emotions that his disappearance had left unresolved. When she returned to the porch, the lawmen were preparing to leave. "We'll need your answer within the week," Clayton said. "The trial date is firm, and without your testimony, Morrison might escape the consequences of his actions." After they left, Theo and Martha sat in silence for a long time, the weight of unspoken truths heavy between them. Finally, Theo spoke. "Tell me about this Mitchell fellow." Martha chose her words carefully, knowing that her husband's reaction would depend not just on what she said, but on what she left unsaid. "He was here years ago. Got thrown from his horse during a storm, broke his leg badly. I nursed him while Doc Harrison was away. And he never forgot the kindness. Apparently not. Kind enough to watch over my family for months without saying a word. Kind enough to make sure my wife and children didn't starve while I was gone." Theo's voice was carefully controlled, but Martha could hear the storm building beneath the surface. "Must have taken considerable dedication. Theo. Must have taken considerable feelings to sustain that kind of devotion." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Martha felt her own temper stir in response to the unfairness of it, the way Theo was twisting James's selfless protection into something sordid. "He saved our lives," she said firmly. "Without his help, you would have come home to find your children dead and your wife not far behind. If you want to resent that, if you want to turn his kindness into something ugly, that's your choice. But I won't apologize for accepting help when my children were starving." Theo flinched as if she'd struck him. "That's not what I meant. Isn't it? You've been looking for someone to blame ever since you got home. Blame yourself for leaving, blame me for accepting help, blame James for giving it. But the truth is, we all did what we had to do to survive, and now we have to live with the consequences." "What consequences?" Martha met her husband's gaze directly, seeing in his eyes the fear that had been driving his accusations. "The consequence of knowing that sometimes strangers show more care for your family than you're able to. The consequence of owing debts that can't be repaid with money. The consequence of having your wife looked after by another man when you couldn't do it yourself." Theo was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the valley where fireflies danced like earthbound stars. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with a pain that went deeper than simple jealousy. "I failed you. I failed the children. I left you alone and defenseless, and another man had to step in and do what I should have done. You went to earn money for your family. There's no shame in that. There's shame in being replaced. In coming home to find that someone else was better at protecting what's mine than I was." Martha felt something snap inside her chest, a cord of patience that had been stretched too tight for too long. "What's yours? Is that what you think we are? Property to be protected and claimed? That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you meant. And maybe that's the real problem here. Maybe the reason James Mitchell could see what we needed when you couldn't is because he saw us as people worth caring about, not possessions to be managed." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Martha saw Theo recoil as if she'd struck him. But she was too angry now to take them back, too tired of walking on eggshells around his wounded pride. "Martha," Theo said quietly, "are you telling me you have feelings for this man?" The question she'd been dreading, asked with the directness that had always been Theo's way. Martha looked at her husband, the father of her children, the man she'd married in hope and love, the partner who had shared her dreams of building a life in the wilderness, and knew that their marriage had reached a crossroads that would determine its future. "I'm telling you that James Mitchell showed my family more genuine care and protection in 6 months than we'd received from anyone else in years. I'm telling you that he risked his own reputation and safety to keep us alive when we had nowhere else to turn. And I'm telling you that if you can't find gratitude for that instead of jealousy, then maybe the problem isn't with him or with me." Theo stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the porch boards. "I'm going to check the livestock." Martha watched him walk away into the darkness, his shoulders rigid with hurt and anger. She remained on the porch long after his footsteps faded, staring up at the stars and wondering how salvation could feel so much like loss. The next morning brought an uncomfortable formality to their household. Theo spoke only when necessary, directing his attention to farm work with an intensity that excluded everything else. The children sensed the tension and grew quiet and watchful, their earlier joy at their father's return dampened by the conflict they couldn't understand but clearly felt. Martha threw herself into her own tasks, cooking, cleaning, mending, tending the garden, but her mind kept returning to the choice she faced. Testifying against Morrison would mean seeing James again, confronting the feelings she'd tried to bury since his disappearance. It would mean acknowledging publicly the extent of his help and the depth of their family's dependence on his charity. But it would also mean seeing justice done, ensuring that other families wouldn't face the threats and intimidation that had made their own suffering worse. 3 days after the marshal's visit, Martha was hanging laundry when she heard a horse approaching at the easy pace of a social call. She looked up to see Doc Harrison riding toward the cabin, his medical bag suggesting this was a professional visit. "Morning, Martha," he called, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose joints reminded him daily of his advancing years. "Thought I'd check on how you're all doing. Theo settling back in all right?" Martha glanced toward the field where her husband was working, close enough to see but too far to overhear. "Well enough, I suppose. The adjustment's been harder than expected." Doc Harrison followed her gaze, his weathered face creased with understanding. "Often is, after a long separation. Folks change during hard times, and not always in ways that make coming together again easy." "Doc, can I ask you something?" "Course you can." Martha chose her words carefully, aware that anything she said would likely make its way through the valley's gossip networks. "When you recommended James Mitchell for the mortgage business, did you know he was the man who'd been helping us?" Doc Harrison was quiet for a moment, studying her face with the careful attention of a man who'd spent decades reading the signs of human suffering. "I suspected. Jimmy always was good at keeping secrets, but there were signs. The timing of things, the knowledge he seemed to have about your situation. And you didn't think to mention it. Wasn't my secret to tell. Besides, sometimes the Lord works through people who prefer to remain anonymous. Didn't seem right to interfere with that." Martha hung another sheet on the line, using the motion to cover her confusion. "Theo thinks there was more to it than simple charity." "What do you think?" The question was asked so gently that Martha found herself answering with more honesty than she'd intended. "I think James Mitchell is a good man who saw a family in need and helped them. I think he asked for nothing in return and expected nothing in return. And I think my husband's pride is making him see complications where none exist." "And what about your heart, Martha? What does that tell you?" Martha's hands stilled on the clothesline. "My heart tells me that gratitude and other feelings can sometimes be hard to separate. But that doesn't make those other feelings real, and it certainly doesn't make them right." Doc Harrison nodded slowly. "You know, in all my years of practicing medicine, I've learned that the heart is probably the most complex organ in the human body. It can hold love for a husband and children, gratitude for a benefactor, and all manner of other feelings without any of them diminishing the others." "That sounds dangerously close to justification, document. Or maybe just understanding. The heart's got room for lots of different kinds of love, Martha. The trick is knowing which ones to act on and which ones to simply acknowledge and then set aside." Before Martha could respond to this unexpected wisdom, Theo appeared from the direction of the barn, his expression grim. "Doc, glad you're here. Maybe you can talk some sense into my wife about this testimony business." "Theo," Martha warned, but he continued without pause. "She's determined to go testify against Morrison, which means spending time with this Mitchell fellow who's been playing guardian angel to my family. Don't seem right to me." Doc Harrison looked between them with the expression of a man who'd witnessed too many family conflicts to be surprised by human nature. "Theo, you know as well as anyone that Morrison needs to face justice for what he's done. Martha's testimony could help ensure that." "Let someone else testify. There were other families threatened. Not all of them are willing to come forward. Some are too scared, others have moved away. Martha might be the only witness with the courage to speak up." Martha felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a yoke. "It's not about courage, document. It's about doing what's right. Even if it means spending time with a man your husband don't trust." The blunt question hung in the air between them, forcing all three to confront the real issue underlying their conflict. Martha looked at Theo, seeing in his face the pain and insecurity that drove his opposition. "James Mitchell has never been anything but honorable in his dealings with this family," she said firmly. "If Theo chooses to see threats where none exist, that's his burden to carry. But I won't let other families suffer because my husband can't trust his own wife to behave appropriately." Theo's face flushed with anger and hurt. "It ain't about trusting you, Martha. It's about understanding why another man would go to such lengths to protect what belongs to someone else." "And there it is again," Martha said, her own temper flaring. "What belongs to someone else? As if I'm a piece of property instead of a person capable of making my own choices." "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you meant, and we both know it. You're more concerned about your ownership of me than you are about justice for Morrison's victims." Doc Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps this is a conversation best held in private. I'll just check on the children and be on my way." But Martha was too angry now to be diplomatic. "No, Doc, stay. Maybe you can help my husband understand that a woman can be grateful to a man without betraying her marriage vows. Maybe you can explain that accepting help when your children are starving isn't the same as inviting improper advances." "Martha, please," Theo began, but she cut him off. "Maybe you can tell him about the nights I sat up wondering if we'd all be dead by morning, about scraping bark off trees to make soup, about watching our children waste away while I waited for word from a husband who might have been dead for all I knew." The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam, months of suppressed fear and desperation finally finding voice. Theo stood frozen, his face pale with the shock of finally understanding what his family had endured. Maybe then he'll understand why James Mitchell's gifts felt like answers to prayer instead of threats to his masculine pride. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Martha's ragged breathing and the distant lowing of cattle. Theo stood looking at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, his earlier anger replaced by something that looked like horror. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I didn't realize it had gotten that bad." Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, suddenly exhausted by the emotional outburst. "You didn't want to know. You wanted to come home and have everything be the way it was before you left. But we can't go back, Theo. Too much has happened, too much has changed." "What's changed is that another man protected my family better than I did," Theo said, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. "What's changed is that my wife looks at me now and sees a man who failed when it mattered most." "What's changed," Martha said gently, "is that we learned we could survive anything if we had to. What's changed is that we discovered there are people in this world who care about justice and protecting the innocent. What's changed is that we have a chance to make sure other families don't go through what we did." She stepped closer to her husband, seeing past his wounded pride to the man she'd married, the father of her children, the partner she'd chosen to build a life with. "Theo, I love you. I married you, I bore your children, I waited for you to come home even when I didn't know if you were alive or dead. But I won't apologize for accepting help when we needed it, and I won't let your pride prevent me from doing what's right." Theo met her gaze, and Martha saw in his eyes the struggle between his hurt feelings and his recognition of her truth. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You're right. About Morrison, about the testimony, about all of it." He took a shaky breath. When I think about another man caring for you the way I should have. James Mitchell cared for us the way neighbors should care for neighbors. The way Christians should care for the vulnerable. The way human beings should care for each other." Martha reached out and took her husband's hand. "But you're the one I chose to share my life with. You're the father of my children. You're the man I want to grow old with, if you can forgive me for doing what I had to do to keep our family alive." "Forgive you?" Theo's voice cracked with emotion. "Martha, I'm the one who needs forgiving. For leaving, for failing you, for being jealous of a man who did what I couldn't." Doc Harrison cleared his throat softly. "If you don't mind me saying, you're both good people who faced an impossible situation and did the best you could. The real question now is whether you're going to let it tear you apart or make you stronger." Martha and Theo looked at each other, then at the valley spread out before them. Their land, saved by mysterious providence and community support. Their children playing safely in the yard. Their future secured by sacrifices and gifts they were only beginning to understand. "I'll go to the territorial capital," Martha said quietly. "I'll testify against Morrison. And when it's over, we'll come home and build the life we always planned to build." Theo squeezed her hand. "We'll go together. All of us. Face whatever comes as a family." Martha nodded, feeling something settle in her chest that had been restless since the night James Mitchell disappeared into the darkness. There would be complications, difficult conversations, emotions to navigate and relationships to rebuild. But they would face them together, as partners, as the family they had fought so hard to preserve. In the distance, thunder rumbled over the mountains, promising the kind of late summer storm that would break the heat and bring relief to the parched earth. Martha smiled, recognizing the sound as a harbinger of renewal, of seasons changing, of the endless cycle of struggle and rest that defined life on the frontier. Whatever came next, they would weather it together. The territorial capital sprawled across the valley floor like an ambitious young city trying to convince itself it was more civilized than it actually was. Wooden sidewalks lined muddy streets where carriages and horsemen vied for space with freight wagons and cattle drives. The courthouse stood at the center of it all, a 3-story brick building that represented law and order in a territory still finding its way between wilderness and civilization. Martha stood at the window of their hotel room, watching the morning bustle below while Theo helped the children dress for what would be a long day of waiting. They had arrived the evening before, the whole family making the journey as Theo had insisted, and Martha was grateful for their presence even as she dreaded the ordeal ahead. "Mama, do you have to talk to the bad men today?" Sarah asked, her small face serious with the kind of worry children shouldn't have to carry. "I have to talk to the judge and jury about what the bad men did," Martha explained gently. "So they can make sure the bad men can't hurt other families the way they tried to hurt us." Benjamin, now 9 and beginning to understand the complexities of adult justice, looked up from where he was struggling with his collar buttons. "Will Mr. Mitchell be there?" Theo's hand stilled on the shirt he was folding, and Martha felt the familiar tension that had shadowed them throughout the journey. They had spoken of practical matters during the 3-day trip, logistics and schedules and arrangements for the children, but the deeper emotional currents remained largely unaddressed. "Mr. Mitchell is the prosecutor," Martha said carefully. "He'll be asking me questions about what happened." "The same Mr. Mitchell who helped us during the winter?" Benjamin pressed, with the persistence of a child who sensed undercurrents he couldn't quite grasp. "Yes, sweetheart. The same one." A knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Theo opened it to reveal a young man in a neat suit, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the earnest expression of someone trying to project authority beyond his years. "Mrs. Cates? I'm David Brennan, assistant to the territorial attorney. Mr. Mitchell sent me to escort you to the courthouse and review your testimony before the proceedings begin." Martha gathered her shawl and reticule, kissing her children goodbye with more emotion than the simple act warranted. Theo walked her to the door, his hand briefly touching her shoulder in a gesture that carried both support and something that might have been warning. "Remember," he said quietly, "you're doing this for justice. For the families who don't have the courage to speak up themselves. Martha nodded, understanding that his words were as much a reminder to himself as to her. They had reached an uneasy peace during the journey, but she knew that seeing James Mitchell again would test the fragile trust they were rebuilding. The courthouse corridors buzzed with activity, lawyers consulting with clients, witnesses waiting nervously on wooden benches, court officials moving with the brisk efficiency of people managing controlled chaos. Brennan led Martha through the maze to a small office where they could review her testimony without interruption. "Mr. Mitchell will join us shortly," Brennan explained, spreading papers across a scarred wooden table. "He wants to ensure you're comfortable with the questions he'll be asking, and that you understand the defense attorney's likely approach." Martha studied the young man's face, noting the careful neutrality that suggested he'd been briefed on the complexities of her situation. "Mr. Brennan, has Mr. Mitchell told you about his connection to my family?" Brennan shifted uncomfortably. "He mentioned that he was familiar with your circumstances. Said it might make the defense attorney more aggressive in trying to discredit your testimony." Before Martha could ask what that meant, the door opened and James Mitchell entered. Martha's breath caught at the sight of him, dressed in a formal black suit that emphasized his lean frame, his dark hair neatly combed, his winter sky eyes focused and professional. This was James Mitchell, the territorial attorney, not the mysterious guardian who had watched over her family from the shadows. "Mrs. Cates," he said formally, offering a slight bow that maintained proper distance while acknowledging their shared history. "Thank you for making the journey to testify. I know it wasn't an easy decision, Mr. Mitchell." Martha was proud of how steady her voice sounded, how well she managed to hide the complicated emotions his presence stirred. "I understand my testimony is important to the case. Critical, I would say." James took a seat across from her, careful to maintain the width of the table between them. "Morrison's defense attorney will try to discredit you by suggesting your testimony is motivated by personal vendetta rather than objective truth. We need to be prepared for that." For the next hour, they reviewed the events of the previous winter and spring, the harassment, the threats, the implications Morrison had made about the source of her family's mysterious support. James's questions were thorough and professional, but Martha caught glimpses of the man who had protected her family in the careful way he phrased inquiries about her emotional state during the worst of their ordeal. "The defense will likely ask about your family's assistance during the winter," James said, his voice carefully neutral. "They may try to imply that your gratitude toward your benefactor has colored your perception of Morrison's actions. And how should I respond to that? With the truth. That you received help from someone who chose to remain anonymous, that this help allowed your family to survive a difficult winter, and that Morrison's threats were real regardless of whatever other support you may have received." Brennan cleared his throat. "There's something else you should know, Mrs. Cates. Morrison's attorney has been asking questions around town about your relationship with Mr. Mitchell. Nothing improper, you understand, but they're clearly building toward something." Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks. "What kind of questions?" "About his visits to your property, about the timing of various events, about whether there might have been understanding between you that would motivate false testimony." James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Which is why we need to address this directly. Mrs. Cates, is there anything about our past interactions that could be misconstrued or used against you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Martha thought of moonlight conversations by the creek, of feelings acknowledged but never acted upon, of the careful distance James had maintained even when her gratitude might have led to complications. "No," she said firmly. "There is nothing improper to misconstrue." "Good. Then we proceed with confidence that the truth will serve justice." As they left the small office and made their way toward the courtroom, Martha was acutely aware of James walking beside her, close enough that she could smell the soap he used, far enough that no observer could suggest impropriety. The careful distance felt like a metaphor for everything between them, close enough to matter, far enough to maintain proper boundaries. The courtroom was packed with spectators, many of whom Martha recognized as families from surrounding counties who had suffered under Morrison's predatory schemes. She saw fear in some faces, hope in others, and a collective determination that justice finally be served. Jake Morrison sat at the defendant's table looking smaller and less threatening than he had during his midnight visits to her cabin. Prison had not been kind to him, and the swagger that had once made him dangerous now seemed like the posturing of a cornered animal. His attorney, a well-dressed man from back east, projected the kind of smooth confidence that came from years of defending the indefensible. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patterson," the bailiff called, and the courtroom erupted in the rustle of standing bodies and settling expectations. Judge Patterson was a stern-faced man in his 60s whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his intolerance for courtroom theatrics. He surveyed the packed courtroom with the expression of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. "Be seated. This court is now in session in the matter of Territory versus Morrison and Associates. Mr. Mitchell, you may call your first witness." James rose with the fluid grace Martha remembered from their moonlight conversation, but his voice when he spoke carried the authority of his office rather than the gentle concern she had known. "The Territory calls Mrs. Martha Cates to the stand." Martha walked to the witness stand on legs that felt steadier than she had expected, her hand firm on the Bible as she swore to tell the truth. From her elevated position, she could see Theo sitting in the front row with their children, his face a study in controlled tension. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw in his expression a mixture of pride, concern, and something that might have been apology. James's direct examination was masterful in its simplicity. He led Martha through the events chronologically, allowing her to tell her story in her own words while guiding her toward the most damaging evidence against Morrison. She described the harassment, the threats, the fear she had felt for her children's safety, and the way Morrison had tried to turn her family's mysterious good fortune into something sordid. "Mrs. Cates," James said as the examination neared its end, "in your opinion, were Mr. Morrison's visits to your property motivated by legitimate debt collection activities?" "No, sir. They were motivated by a desire to intimidate and frighten my family into abandoning our legal rights." "And how did these visits affect you and your children?" Martha thought of Sarah's silent tears, of Benjamin's protective stance despite his youth, of her own sleepless nights wondering if Morrison would escalate his threats to violence. "They terrorized us. Mr. Morrison wanted us to know that we were vulnerable, that we had no protection, that he could take whatever he wanted whenever he chose to take it." "Thank you, Mrs. Cates. No further questions." Morrison's attorney rose with the predatory smile of a man who believed he held the winning cards. He was younger than Martha had expected, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of Eastern education and expensive tailoring. "Mrs. Cates, you've painted quite a picture of Mr. Morrison as some sort of frontier villain. But isn't it true that he was simply doing his job as an agent for legitimate creditors? His job didn't require threatening my children or making improper insinuations about my character." "Ah yes, these mysterious insinuations. Tell me, Mrs. Cates, what exactly did Mr. Morrison insinuate?" Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "He suggested that the help my family was receiving must be payment for inappropriate services." And this help you were receiving, it was quite substantial, wasn't it? Food, supplies, money, enough to keep your family comfortable through what you've described as a desperate winter. It was enough to keep us alive. Alive and, according to witnesses, looking quite well fed and healthy by spring. Tell me, Mrs. Cates, who was providing this generous assistance? James half rose from his chair. Objection, Your Honor. The source of Mrs. Cates's legitimate assistance is not relevant to the charges against Mr. Morrison. Your Honor, the defense attorney countered smoothly, the source of this assistance goes directly to Mrs. Cates's credibility and potential motivation for false testimony. Judge Patterson considered for a moment. I'll allow it, but keep it relevant, Counselor. Mrs. Cates, who was helping your family? Martha met the attorney's gaze directly. I don't know. The gifts were left anonymously. You never discovered the identity of your benefactor? Martha hesitated, aware that James was watching her intently from the prosecutor's table. The truth was complicated. She hadn't known during the winter months, but she had learned later. How to answer without opening doors she didn't want opened. Not during the time Mr. Morrison was harassing my family. But you learned later? I learned that someone had been watching over us, yes. And who was that someone? James stood again. Objection. This line of questioning is clearly intended to embarrass and intimidate the witness rather than establish facts relevant to the case. Your Honor, the defense attorney said, Mrs. Cates's relationship with her mysterious benefactor is directly relevant to her credibility and potential bias. Judge Patterson leaned back in his chair, studying both attorneys with the expression of a man who had presided over too many courtroom battles to be impressed by legal maneuvering. Mrs. Cates, he said directly, did your benefactor ever ask you to lie or distort your testimony in this case? No, Your Honor. Never. Did your benefactor ever suggest that you had any obligation to him beyond simple gratitude? No, Your Honor. Then I fail to see how his identity is relevant to these proceedings. Move on, Counselor. The defense attorney's smile became slightly strained, but he pressed forward. Mrs. Cates, isn't it true that you were so grateful to your mysterious benefactor that you would do anything to protect him, including lying under oath? Martha felt anger flare in her chest, not at the question, but at the implication that her testimony was somehow tainted by personal feelings rather than objective truth. Sir, I am under oath before God and this court to tell the truth about what Jake Morrison did to my family. My testimony has nothing to do with gratitude or protection or anything else except the facts of what happened. But you admit you feel gratitude toward this benefactor? Of course I do. When someone saves your children's lives, gratitude is the natural response. Enough gratitude to lie for him? Martha straightened in her chair, drawing on the strength that had carried her through months of near starvation and fear. I have never lied for anyone, sir. I am telling this court the truth about Jake Morrison's criminal behavior because other families deserve protection from the same threats and intimidation my family endured. If you want to twist that into something improper, that says more about your character than mine. A murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom before Judge Patterson's gavel restored order. The defense attorney tried several more approaches, but Martha's testimony remained consistent and unshakable. When he finally dismissed her, she felt as though she had just survived a battle. As Martha stepped down from the witness stand, her eyes found James's across the courtroom. For just a moment, his professional mask slipped, and she saw in his expression the same protective concern that had sustained her family through their darkest hours. Then the mask was back in place, and he was once again the territorial attorney prosecuting a case, rather than the man who had loved her family from the shadows. The trial continued for 2 more days, with additional witnesses testifying to Morrison's pattern of intimidation and fraud. The evidence was overwhelming, the jury's verdict swift and decisive. Morrison and his remaining associates were sentenced to terms that would ensure they posed no further threat to frontier families. On their last evening in the territorial capital, Martha stood once again at the hotel window, watching the street below while Theo settled their children for the night. They would leave in the morning, returning to their valley and their farm and the life they were rebuilding together. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Theo answered to find James Mitchell standing in the hallway, hat in hand, looking like a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say but wasn't sure he should say it. "Mr. Cates, Mrs. Cates. I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to thank you both for your courage in testifying and to say goodbye before you leave tomorrow." Theo stepped back, gesturing for James to enter. "Come in, Mr. Mitchell. We owe you more thanks than we can ever express." James entered hesitantly, his gaze taking in the modest hotel room, the children's clothes laid out for tomorrow's journey, the domestic scene of a family preparing to return home. When his eyes met Martha's, she saw in them the same complex mixture of emotions she felt: gratitude, regret, affection, and the bittersweet knowledge that some connections could never be fully explored. "The thanks should go to your wife," James said to Theo. "Her testimony was crucial to securing the conviction. She showed remarkable courage under very difficult circumstances." "She did indeed," Theo replied, and Martha heard in his voice a pride that had been missing since his return home. "My wife has always been stronger than she knows." James nodded, then turned his attention to the children, who had emerged from their beds to see the visitor. "Sarah, Benjamin, you've grown since I last saw you. I trust you're taking good care of your parents." "We're helping Papa with the farm," Benjamin said proudly. "Mama says we're old enough for real responsibilities now." "I'm sure you are. And I'm sure your parents are very proud of how brave you've been through everything." Sarah stepped closer, studying James with the directness of childhood. "Are you the man who brought us food when we were hungry?" The question hung in the room like a challenge, forcing all the adults to confront the truth that had been carefully dancing around the edges of their conversation. James looked at Martha, then at Theo, seeking permission for honesty. Theo nodded slowly. "It's all right. They're old enough to understand kindness when they see it." James knelt down to Sarah's level, bringing his face closer to hers. "I did bring you food, sweetheart. And I was very glad I could help when your family needed it. Why didn't you tell us it was you? Sometimes the best way to help people is to let them keep their dignity. Your mama and papa are proud people who take care of their own family. I didn't want them to feel bad about accepting help." Sarah considered this with the seriousness of a child processing adult complexities. "But you were like our guardian angel. More like a neighbor who had the means to help and the good sense to do it quietly." Benjamin, older and more perceptive, asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. "Will we see you again?" James glanced at Martha and Theo before answering. "I'll always care about your family's welfare, but your papa is home now to take care of you. You don't need a guardian angel anymore." After James left, Martha and Theo sat in the lamplight while their children slept, processing the emotional weight of the day and the week and the months that had led them to this moment. "He loves you," Theo said quietly, without accusation or anger, simply stating a fact he had finally accepted. "Yes," Martha replied, because there was no point in denying what they had all seen in James's eyes when he looked at her. "I believe he does. And you love him." Martha was quiet for a long moment, searching for words that would be honest without being hurtful. I love him the way you love someone who saves your children's lives. I love him the way you love someone who shows you that there's still goodness in the world when you're tempted to despair. But I'm not in love with him, Theo. There's a difference. Theo nodded slowly, and Martha could see him processing this distinction, weighing it against his own fears and insecurities. I've been thinking about what you said back home, he continued. About how I see you as property instead of a partner. You were right, and I'm sorry for that. Theo. No, let me finish. I left you alone with the children, and when I came back, I was more concerned about my wounded pride than your survival. I was jealous of a man who did what I couldn't, instead of being grateful that he cared enough to step in when you needed help. Martha reached across the small space between their chairs and took her husband's hand. We both did what we thought was best. You went to earn money for the family, I accepted help to keep us alive, and James protected us because he's a good man who believes in taking care of people. Nobody did anything wrong. What happens now? When we go home, when we try to build our life again? Martha squeezed his hand, feeling in his calloused fingers the strength that had drawn her to him years ago, the steadiness that had made her choose him as her partner in the great adventure of frontier life. Now we remember that we chose each other before any of this happened, and we choose each other again. We raise our children, we work our land, we build the life we always planned to build. And we remember that love isn't diminished by gratitude, that marriage isn't threatened by kindness from others, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone you care about is letting them go. Theo was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the gas-lit streets of the territorial capital. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions made and peace found. He's a good man. Yes, he is. He could have taken advantage of the situation, could have used our desperation to his benefit. But he didn't. No, he didn't. That tells me everything I need to know about his character. And about yours. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the late evening activity below their window. Couples returning from dinner, businessmen heading to saloons, families like their own preparing for sleep in a strange place before continuing their journeys. Martha, Theo said finally, when we get home, I want to plant a garden. A proper one, with flowers as well as vegetables. Something beautiful, not just practical. Martha smiled, understanding that this was Theo's way of saying he was ready to build a life that included beauty and hope along with the hard necessities of survival. I'd like that very much. And I want to write a letter to James Mitchell. To thank him properly, the way a man should thank someone who protected his family when he couldn't. He would appreciate that. Will you help me with the words? I'm not much good at expressing complicated feelings. Martha squeezed his hand again, feeling tears prick her eyes at the generosity of spirit her husband was showing. Of course I will. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the promise of good traveling weather. As their wagon rolled out of the territorial capital and began the 3-day journey home, Martha looked back only once at the courthouse where justice had been served and old accounts finally settled. James Mitchell stood on the courthouse steps, watching their departure with the same careful distance he had maintained throughout their reunion. When their eyes met across the growing space between them, Martha raised her hand in a gesture that was both goodbye and blessing. James touched his hat in response, a formal acknowledgement that somehow conveyed everything that needed to be said between them. As the wagon rolled toward home, Martha felt the weight of the past year finally lifting from her shoulders. They had survived winter and starvation, harassment and threats, the complex emotions of salvation and gratitude and unspoken love. They had faced the test of their marriage and emerged not unscathed, but stronger for having worked through their fears and jealousies and pride. The children chattered excitedly about returning home, about seeing their animals and checking their garden and sleeping in their own beds. Theo drove with the easy confidence of a man who knew his destination and was content with his choices. And Martha watched the familiar landscape of their valley unfold before them, each hill and creek and stand of cottonwoods welcome reminders of the life they had fought so hard to preserve. That evening, as they made camp beneath stars that seemed brighter than any Martha remembered, she realized that some stories don't end with dramatic declarations or passionate embraces. Sometimes they end with the quiet satisfaction of duty done, love tested and proven strong, and the deep peace that comes from knowing you've made the right choices even when those choices required sacrifice. James Mitchell would always be a part of their story, the mysterious guardian who had watched over them in their darkest hour, the man who had shown them that love could take many forms and that sometimes the greatest gift was knowing when to step back into the shadows. But their story, the real story of Martha and Theo and their children, would continue long after he was just a memory of kindness in a difficult season. As Martha drifted off to sleep beneath the vast frontier sky, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for all the forms love had taken in their lives, the steady devotion of marriage, the fierce protection of parenthood, the generous care of a friend, and the collective strength of a community that looked after its own. Tomorrow they would be home, ready to plant that garden Theo had promised, ready to build the beautiful life they had learned they were strong enough to create and defend. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and Martha smiled at the sound. Even the wilderness knew something about love and loyalty, and the endless cycle of separation and reunion that defined life on the frontier. Some bonds were meant to last forever, some were meant to shine briefly and then fade to cherished memory, and the wisdom lay in knowing the difference.